The year was 1492, and while Columbus sailed toward unknown shores, a different kind of darkness was spreading across the heart of Christendom. In the marble halls of the Vatican, where saints were supposed to walk among mortals, a man of unprecedented corruption had seized the throne of St. Peter. His name was Rodrigo Borgia, but history would know him by a title that still sends chills through the corridors of power: Pope Alexander VI. What you're about to discover will shatter everything you thought you knew about papal authority and religious devotion. This wasn't simply a case of moral weakness or political ambition gone astray. This was systematic evil orchestrated from the highest office in Christianity, a reign of terror that would make medieval tyrants seem like choir boys in comparison. The man who claimed divine authority over 1 billion souls had turned the Vatican into something resembling a criminal empire, more than a holy sanctuary. Today, we're going to expose the horrific truth behind one of history's most notorious pontiffs, a man who weaponized faith itself in service of the most depraved appetites imaginable. By the time we're finished, you'll understand why Alexander VI didn't just corrupt the papacy, but came dangerously close to destroying Christianity itself from within. This is a story of murder, incest, betrayal, and blasphemy on a scale that defies comprehension. The seeds of this catastrophe were planted decades before Rodrigo Borgia ever donned papal robes. Born in 1431 in the Spanish town of Chativa, he entered a world where the Catholic Church had already begun its slide into institutional corruption. The papal court of the 15th century bore little resemblance to the humble fishermen who had followed Christ. Instead, it had become a glittering cesspool of political intrigue, financial manipulation, and sexual scandal. But even in this environment of systemic decay, Rodrigo Borgia stood out as something exceptional in his capacity for evil. While other clerics might dabble in worldly pleasures or political scheming, Borgia approached corruption with the methodical precision of a master strategist. He understood that true power came not from pious devotion, but from controlling the desires and fears of others. Every relationship he formed, every favor he granted, every alliance he forged was calculated to advance his inexorable march toward ultimate authority. His rise through the ecclesiastical hierarchy reads like a manual for organizational corruption. Appointed cardinal at the impossibly young age of 25 through the influence of his uncle Pope Calixtus III, Borgia quickly learned that sacred office could be bought, sold, and traded like any other commodity. He accumulated benefices across Europe, each position generating streams of income that he funneled into his growing network of influence. By the time he reached middle age, Rodrigo Borgia had effectively turned significant portions of the church into his personal business empire. The papal election of 1492 represents one of the most brazen examples of simony in church history. Borgia didn't simply buy the papacy. He orchestrated a campaign of bribery and intimidation so comprehensive that it left his competitors helpless. Cardinals received everything from gold and land to promises of lucrative appointments for their relatives. Those who couldn't be bought faced threats that made resistance seem foolhardy. When the votes were finally counted, the College of Cardinals had essentially auctioned off the throne of St. Peter to the highest bidder. What followed was a papacy that transformed the Vatican into something unrecognizable. Alexander VI didn't merely bend church doctrine to suit his personal needs. He perverted it so completely that the institution itself became a vehicle for his most twisted ambitions. The man who was supposed to be Christ's representative on earth instead created a court that would have made Roman emperors blush with shame. The scope of Alexander's corruption extended far beyond personal vice into systematic destruction of everything the papacy was meant to represent. He openly acknowledged his illegitimate children, appointing them to positions of power within the church hierarchy, despite canon law explicitly forbidding such practices. His son Cesare became a cardinal at 18, while his daughter Lucrezia was used as a political pawn in marriages designed to advance Borgia family interests. The sacred and the profane became so intertwined in Alexander's court that visiting dignitaries struggled to distinguish between religious ceremonies and political theater. But perhaps most disturbing, was how Alexander weaponized religious authority to eliminate his enemies. Excommunication, once reserved for the gravest spiritual offenses, became a tool of political intimidation. Those who opposed Borgia family interests found themselves cut off from the sacraments, their souls supposedly condemned to eternal damnation by papal decree. The interdict, a punishment that denied entire regions access to religious services, was deployed against territories that resisted Alexander's temporal ambitions. He had turned the keys of heaven into instruments of earthly coercion. The financial corruption under Alexander's reign reached levels that stagger the imagination. The sale of indulgences, already a controversial practice, became industrialized under his administration. Wealthy sinners could purchase forgiveness for virtually any crime, while the poor faced eternal damnation for minor transgressions they couldn't afford to absolve. Ecclesiastical offices were auctioned to the highest bidders regardless of their qualifications or moral character. The papal treasury, supposedly dedicated to charitable works and spiritual missions, became a slush fund for Borgia family expenditures. More sinister still were the mysterious deaths that seemed to follow in Alexander's wake. Cardinals who opposed his policies had an alarming tendency to succumb to sudden illnesses. Nobles who controlled territories coveted by the Borgias experienced unfortunate accidents. Political rivals discovered that challenging the Pope's temporal authority could prove hazardous to their health. While direct evidence remained elusive, the pattern was unmistakable to contemporary observers, who understood that Alexander's reach extended far beyond spiritual matters. The Pope's personal conduct scandalized even a court already inured to excess. His relationship with Julia Farnese, known throughout Rome as the Pope's whore, was conducted with such openness that it became a source of international embarrassment for the Church. Diplomatic correspondence from the period reveals the shock of foreign ambassadors at the brazenness of Alexander's sexual appetites. The man who demanded celibacy from his priests maintained multiple mistresses within the papal palace itself. Even more disturbing were the whispered allegations surrounding Alexander's relationship with his own daughter Lucrezia. Contemporary chroniclers, writing in coded language to avoid charges of libel, hinted at unspeakable crimes within the papal apartments. The boundaries between paternal affection and carnal desire seemed to blur in ways that horrified even Alexander's supporters. These weren't mere rumors spread by political enemies. They came from sources within the Vatican itself, people who had witnessed the Pope's behavior firsthand. The infamous papal banquets became legendary throughout Europe for their combination of religious ceremony and debauched entertainment. Guests reported witnessing orgies conducted in rooms adorned with religious artifacts, where sacred vessels were used to serve wine while prostitutes performed acts that mocked the very sacraments they surrounded. Alexander presided over these spectacles with evident pleasure, treating the symbols of Christianity as props in elaborate theatrical productions designed to demonstrate his power over both sacred and profane domains. Yet perhaps the most chilling aspect of Alexander's reign was how he managed to maintain the facade of legitimate papal authority throughout his most egregious crimes. He continued to celebrate Mass, issue papal bulls, and receive foreign dignitaries as though his behavior were perfectly consistent with Christian doctrine. This wasn't simple hypocrisy. It was a calculated assault on the very concept of moral authority. By demonstrating that even the Pope could transgress every conceivable boundary while retaining his position, Alexander was systematically destroying faith in institutional Christianity itself. The international ramifications of Alexander's pontificate extended far beyond the borders of the papal states. European monarchs, who had once deferred to papal authority, began questioning whether such a thoroughly corrupted office deserved their respect. Protestant reformers seized upon Alexander's scandals as evidence that the entire Catholic hierarchy had become irredeemably corrupt. The seeds of the Reformation, which would split Christianity apart just decades later, were watered with the blood and debauchery of the Borgia pontificate. The Pope's military campaigns revealed another dimension of his twisted character. Unlike previous pontiffs, who reluctantly engaged in warfare to defend church territories, Alexander actively sought conquest as a means of expanding Borgia family power. His son Cesare led papal armies across central Italy, leaving trails of destruction that had nothing to do with defending Christian interests and everything to do with carving out hereditary duchies for the Borgia clan. These campaigns were funded through increasingly desperate financial schemes that bled the church treasury dry. Alexander created new cardinalships specifically to sell them to wealthy families seeking prestige. He confiscated the property of deceased clergy, claiming it for papal use rather than allowing it to pass to rightful heirs. Most grotesquely, he began charging fees for performing basic sacraments, turning baptisms, marriages, and even last rites into commercial transactions. The College of Cardinals, once composed of learned theologians and pious administrators, became a marketplace where influence could be purchased outright. Alexander appointed men whose only qualifications were their ability to pay for the privilege or their usefulness in advancing Borgia political interests. Cardinals who dared question papal policies found themselves reassigned to distant dioceses or simply excluded from important decisions. The institution that was supposed to advise and occasionally constrain papal power had been transformed into a rubber stamp for Alexander's most outrageous schemes. Contemporary records reveal the extent to which fear permeated the papal court during Alexander's reign. Servants whispered about mysterious disappearances among the Vatican staff. Guards spoke in hushed tones about bodies discovered in the Tiber River after floating downstream from the direction of the papal palace. Even high-ranking clergy began sleeping with locked doors and tasting their food before consuming it, understanding that proximity to the Borgias could prove lethal. The Pope's use of poison as a political weapon became so notorious that it entered common parlance across Europe. The phrase, Borgia wine, became synonymous with assassination by poisoning. Alexander's dinner invitations were simultaneously coveted and feared, as guests understood they might be entering a trap disguised as hospitality. The papal kitchens employed food tasters whose life expectancy was notably brief, and recipes for various toxins were allegedly kept in the same libraries that housed theological manuscripts. Alexander's treatment of the Jewish population in Rome provided another window into his moral bankruptcy. While publicly maintaining traditional church positions regarding Jews, he privately extorted enormous sums from Jewish merchants and moneylenders through threats of expulsion or violence. He would grant protection to Jewish communities one day and revoke it the next, depending on his immediate financial needs or political calculations. This cynical manipulation of religious prejudice for personal gain demonstrated how completely Alexander had divorced religious authority from any semblance of moral principle. The papal court's relationship with Renaissance artists and scholars became equally corrupted under Alexander's influence. While he commissioned magnificent works of art that still adorn Vatican walls today, the process was tainted by the same moral rot that infected everything he touched. Artists were forced to incorporate Borgia family symbols into religious scenes, creating bizarre juxtapositions of sacred imagery with personal aggrandizement. Scholars who produced works praising the Pope received generous patronage, while those who maintained intellectual independence found themselves excluded from papal favor, or worse. Even Alexander's approach to church doctrine revealed his fundamental contempt for the institution he ostensibly led. He issued papal bulls that contradicted previous church teachings when it suited his purposes, treating theological consistency as an inconvenient obstacle to immediate gratification. The infallibility of papal pronouncements became a joke when the Pope himself changed positions based on political expediency rather than spiritual conviction. The international intelligence networks that developed around Alexander's court reflected the paranoid atmosphere of his reign. Foreign ambassadors maintained elaborate spy systems to monitor papal activities, understanding that Alexander's policies could shift without warning, based on his personal interests, rather than any coherent diplomatic strategy. The Vatican, once a center of spiritual authority that transcended national boundaries, had become just another Italian principality engaged in the same petty power struggles that characterized the fractured peninsula. Alexander VI died in August 1503, his bloated corpse a fitting monument to the corruption he had embodied for over a decade. Yet the damage he inflicted on Christianity extended far beyond his mortal existence. This was a man who proved that absolute power could corrupt absolutely, transforming the most sacred office in Christendom into an instrument of evil that would haunt the Church for centuries. His legacy stands as a chilling reminder that even institutions claiming divine authority remain vulnerable to the darkest aspects of human nature.